Welcome to Nerds at Church, a queer feminist indie podcast diving deep into faith, nerdery, and the Bible. I'm Pastor Kay, and I use pronouns like she and her.
And I'm Pastor Emily, and my pronouns are they, them, theirs.
And I'm layperson Pace, and I use they, them, or no pronouns.
In this episode, we are diving into the story of Superman with a couple other heroes as well. The story of our biblical hero, Ruth, comes up in the lectionary this year for Proper 27, also known as Lectionary 32, which is the reading for the 25th Sunday after Pentecost in 2024. And that reading is Ruth 3, 1 through 5, and 4, 13 through 17, which are the verses mostly surrounding the specific ones we'll talk about today. So we'll link to that as well as any other connections from past episodes in our episode description. We have one content notification for this episode. We do mention suicidal ideation in our discussion on Superman.
We'd also like to invite you to become a Patreon supporter for more content at patreon.com/nerdsatchurch, and check out the episode description for links to any other references we make in this episode. There are gonna be some.
Indeed.
Join me. I'm a Patreon supporter.
Yeah! Pace is one of our
Absolutely.
first and longest Patreon supporters, in fact.
Yes.
Definitely join Pace in that. And this week, we are so excited to have Pace as our special guest. Pace Warfield is the creator and co-host of Horror Nerds at Church, a ridiculously queer podcast about horror movies and theology. They are a PhD candidate at the Graduate Theological Union, where their research interests include queer theology and Reformation studies. A lifelong Superman fan, they once had a Superman blog called Tomes of Steel, and they live in the Twin Cities metropolitan area with their partner and 2 dogs.
It's true.
Yay, Pace!
Absolutely.
Yay.
We are so glad to have you back.
Yay. Thanks for having me back.
Yeah.
And our overall theme this week is the ways that immigrants and their families improve the places that they're in.
So, as we dive into our new format, this is the first episode, obviously, with our new format, so we're excited to see how this flows. Our historical heroes for today are Delores Huerta and Cesar Chavez from the United Farm Workers. And Delores Clara Fernandez Huerta was born April 10th, 1930 in Dawson, New Mexico, and she is still alive. She is 94 years old, which is wonderful and amazing. And Cesario Estrada Chavez was born March 31st, 1927, and died April 23rd, 1993, both in the state of Arizona. And the United Farm Workers began in the early 1960s. It was begun by Cesar Chavez, Delores Huerta, Larry Itliong, and other organizers, and is the nation's first enduring and largest farm workers union. The UFW continues its activism in major agricultural sectors, especially in California, which is where they originated. And we are talking about them because they are people who made the communities they were in better and made the countries they were in better. And they are both children of immigrants. So Delores Huerta's parents were immigrants and Cesar Chavez's parents were also immigrants. And Delores Huerta is not only a labor leader, but also a civil rights activist. And they together co-founded the United Farm Workers Association, which then merged with the Agricultural Workers Organizing Committee to become the United Farm Workers. And the United Farm Workers is probably the thing that they're most well known for. The United Farm Workers helped organize the Delano grape strike, based out of Delano, California, in 1965 in California. And they were the lead negotiators in the workers' contract that was created after the strike. Some interesting and sometimes controversial points because, as we know, heroes are not always without fault and without critique. So ideologically, Chavez's worldview combined leftist politics with Catholic social teachings, and he began his work with the community service organization registering voters, which is interesting because Delores. Huerta also worked on registering voters, and that was part of how she got involved. One of the controversial things about Chavez is that for a significant amount of time, he viewed undocumented immigrants as a major source of strike breaking. And so he actually campaigned against undocumented immigration in the United States, which caused a lot of harm and schisms within the United Farm Workers, as well as generating violence along the U.S.-Mexico border, because people who migrate to this country to work tend to be folks who are desperate to help and to earn money for their family and for themselves so they can make a living. And so basically that was like a successful example of divide and conquer from the powers that be, which we're not about here on this podcast.
Yeah.
Huerta is the originator of the very popular, very well-known phrase, "Si se puede," which is a big organizing phrase. It's like a yes, we can, but has more meaning in Spanish, as many phrases do that originate in another language. And she has been the subject of so many ballads and murals and all sorts of things because of just how amazing she is. One of the things that I found out while I was researching this, which I think is so cool, is that she and Gloria Steinem actually championed intersectional activism in the 1960s. Huerta was traveling to New York for the boycott of California table grapes and was focused on bringing women into the fight for rights. And so she was trying to get women at various conventions to support the farm workers. And then at the convention, Gloria Steinem voiced support for Huerta's cause, which then kind of had this reciprocal, they were supporting each other. So Huerta was supporting feminist movement and calls herself a born-again feminist. And by incorporating both of those views into the workers' rights and into feminist movements, Huerta was able to then have a greater impact on how women were treated in the workforce, and Steinem was able to expand the feminist movement to include issues around race and feminism so that it stopped being quite so much just for white women. And then some of the things that the UFW is known for and that they have accomplished in their support of farm workers is some of the first laws in the nation providing farm workers with overtime pay after 8 hours of work, some of the first comprehensive standards in the U.S. to prevent heat deaths and illnesses, COVID protections for agricultural workers, and they've been a leader in the national movement for immigration reform, which is really great to see, particularly given Chavez's views on immigration earlier in life. And they continue to champion a lot of legislative and regulatory reforms to support farm workers, which is really great. And I love the different ways that they both coincide with the leaders and kind of diverge, right? The ways that we see Chavez's history in particular weaving in and also weaving out, and then the ongoing work of Huerta and her life that continues today. She was one of the honorary co-chairs of the Women's March in 2017 in DC, which I think is just delightful. Yeah, and so some of the ways that I really appreciated that these stories tied into our overall theme is both Huerta and Chavez are children of immigrants and get some of their passion around justice and work for farm workers from their family. Huerta's mom, in particular, was a very visible role model for caring for farm workers in her work, and so that inspired and led to Huerta's work in organizing and strikes and working for better conditions. Chavez definitely took on a lot of the faith practices that he was taught. So his family was Catholic and his grandmother practiced a kind of folk Catholicism, and those particularly social teachings were passed on and were very strong for Chavez. And then also the UFW and the predecessor groups connected at one point with the United Auto Workers and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And so I just think those different ways that not only are these organizations and these people gaining wisdom and gaining inspiration from their ancestors and immigrants, but also the ways that they're connecting then with a lot of other folks who maybe on the surface we don't think have connections, because auto workers and agricultural workers are two totally different groups, and yet the collaboration was really cool. I thought that was really cool.
Awesome.
Living in California, Cesar Chavez was very well known and celebrated.
Oh, yeah.
March 31st is Cesar Chavez Day. Sadly, Delores Huerta is not as publicly recognized in the ways that Cesar Chavez is in California, at least.
Yeah, and I think largely that is the case nationwide. Like, even when I was looking up the media around both of them, there's a bunch where this shows up in something about Chavez. And the reality is that she has done so much and continues to do so much. And
yeah,
I think sometimes what has happened with Dr. King also happens with Chavez, where once someone dies, then there's so much more space to
the legacy,
aggrandize what they did and make it seem like they're the only ones, which is, not accurate. But it also, like, there's some obvious sexism there, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah. So Huerta was one of the subjects of the Sylvia Morales film A Crushing Love in 2009, which was a sequel to Chicana. And in the movie, as we said, Cesar Chavez from 2014, which was done by Diego Luna, Huerta is actually portrayed by the actress and activist Rosario Dawson.
Yep, who, more connections to superheroes. Rosario voices Wonder Woman in numerous DC animated projects. And of course, she's the live-action Ahsoka, so check out Horror Nerds at Church for more Rosario Dawson for our Ahsoka stuff.
Yeah.
And also the story of how I am 3 degrees away from Rosario Dawson. We talk about that one of our boot tubes.
Yeah. And there is a 2017 documentary specifically about Dolores Huerta called Delores. And both Huerta and Chavez appear in the graphic memoir Tata Rambo La Voz de Mayo by Henry Barajas and Bernardo Brice, which is really cool. But yeah, there's just so many things.
And I love that we have Labor Day as kind of a labor justice holiday, and then California has Cesar Chavez Day as a labor justice holiday. But those are really the only labor justice holidays we have. Martin Luther King Jr., of course, was a big labor justice person, but that's not the reason why the U.S. commemorates him.
Yeah.
And tries to pretend that work of his didn't happen.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Because then we'd have to pay people real money.
Right.
Ooh. Yeah, there was a meme the other day that was like comparing a bunch of billionaires, like their wages in 2012 and their wages in 2022. And then it had minimum wage workers. $7.25 and $7.25. Yeah, it's bad. But yeah, they're wonderful heroes, and they're complicated heroes, and heroes that are very clearly connected to their own community, but also other communities, and working together for common causes, which I think is just really great as we continue to deconstruct the myths that we have created in this country around what it means to be a hero.
And for that matter, the myths that we have created in this country about what immigrants and their families bring to us. Because America would look very different if we hadn't had those two.
Yeah, for sure.
Speaking of the gifts that immigrants bring to the countries they come to, our biblical hero for this episode is Ruth. One of the nice things about Ruth is that if you want to read her story, all you have to do is check out your Bible's table of context, because she has her own book. So you will find the story of Ruth in the book of Ruth. It's very convenient. And Ruth was a woman from the country of Moab. She met and married an Israelite man there who had traveled there with his parents and his brother. And his brother also got married. And then her husband, her brother-in-law, and her father-in-law all died in a fairly short span of time. And her mother-in-law encouraged her and her sister-in-law to return to their families of origin, but instead Ruth stayed with her mother-in-law, who was originally named Naomi, but at this point in her life renamed herself Mara, which translates to bitter, and was a sign of her grief. And the two of them went back to Israel together, which was, of course, her mother-in-law's homeland. And When they arrived in Israel, they found her mother-in-law's distant cousin, Boaz, who was impressed by Ruth's devotion to his cousin, and also a fairly major landowner in the area, and so he offered Ruth his protection as she gathered grain that was left for the poor in his fields. And after a festival, she did the act that the Bible passage that we're focusing on today also includes. She decided that the protection he was offering her so far was not enough to keep her and her mother-in-law safe, and so she arranged things to make it look like he had had sex with her while he was blackout drunk.
Just a note for as you're reading the Bible, if you're reading the Bible passages, this is one of the examples where feet in the Bible does not mean the things that you walk on.
Yeah, that's a euphemism,
Just
kids.
To be clear. Yep.
Yeah. Also, I feel like I should point out there are radically few marriages in the Bible that are what we would call good examples of marriages today. And while Ruth and Boaz clearly have a certain amount of respect and even fondness for each other, the way their relationship started is, morally complicated and gray. And so after this, Boaz goes to... Well, he actually goes to the town square, but it served as the court in that time and place. And so he knew that there was another cousin of the family that was actually more closely related to Ruth's mother-in-law, and that other cousin should have been responsible for the women. But he went to the court and he argued with that cousin to keep the two essentially in his household. And then he went home and married Ruth. So what I get from that part of the story is that they both wanted to be married to each other, maybe not for, warm and fuzzy reasons that we have now, but they both definitely consented to the marriage, let's put it that way. And they go on to have a son, and their son, Obed, became part of Jesus' genealogy. And this is kind of extraordinary because earlier in the Bible, the Israelites are told specifically to shun Moabites entirely as one of the neighboring countries. The Moabites are maybe not the source of all evil, but definitely very bad and should be avoided, and certainly don't intermarry. But eventually we have this story of Ruth, who marries two Israelites and becomes a heroine of the Hebrew Scriptures with her own book that is named after her. And then for Christians, she also contributes directly to Jesus' family line. And so when it comes to a story of immigrants bringing good things to the countries that they settle in, Ruth is certainly an excellent example. For book recommendations, I did want to do a quick shout out. As fans of the podcast may remember, Emily and I first met in a group for clergy, and another colleague of ours from that group, whose name is Melinda Mitchell, wrote a fictional novel which is the story of Ruth set in space, and it's called Next of Kin.
Ooh.
And I haven't actually gotten to read it yet, but it sounds very interesting. It also includes a lot of stuff about war veterans and the effects that can have on interplanetary civilization. And so it looks fascinating.
Yeah.
I couldn't help but recommend that. And then also, if you just want to get a better sense for the Bible, I believe in several previous episodes I have brought up the series by N.T. Wright or Tom Wright called For Everyone, which is basically a New Testament book of the Bible for everyone, Luke for everyone, Acts for everyone, so on. And so he did those books for the New Testament, and then another author named John Goldenjay took that idea and continued the series with the Hebrew Scriptures. And so there is a book called Joshua, Judges, and Ruth for everyone, and the nice thing about this is that it is directed at and meant for people that don't have theology degrees. And if you just want to get to know the Bible better, it takes each book, divvies them up into short passages, and then gives you a few paragraphs to read about that short passage. And it does a really nice job of explaining some running themes in the Bible, how certain language idioms and such, how the language functions differently through translation, and just gives you a general good background into especially the cultural issues at play in each story. And so Joshua, Judges, and Ruth for Everyone is John Goldenjay expanding on those books and the background helpful for each of them.
Nice. Yeah, that's awesome. Also, I will just say I love Ruth, and we'll get into more of... I think there are some really cool connections also between all of our heroes, in addition to the more obvious one around immigrants and families and their families and how they impact the communities they're in.
Yeah.
So I'm excited when we get to that point. But now, our main hero of the day, who, as we mentioned in our introductory episode, Pace has informed us is in many ways the first of the superheroes, the kind of model that we have, and the first one to become what we now know very commonly as superhero. So, Pace, who is Superman?
Strap in, folks. I have like 10 pages of notes. Oh my goodness. I love Superman. Superman is his public identity. I'm sure everyone has probably heard of Superman in the world because he is just like such a kind of like Mickey Mouse or similar pop cultural figures, just so huge globally, not just in this country. But Superman is his public identity. He was born and given the name Kal-El at birth. And then when he was adopted on Earth, he was given the name Clark Kent. So 3 names, 1 person.
Not only Trinitarian, but also feels like some connections with trans and naming. Interesting.
Yeah, I want to talk about that a little bit more. We'll see how much of this makes it to the main feed to your ear holes. So if you want more of this, please go to the Patreon and listen to me go on about Superman for hours.
Yes,
Absolutely.
all of our uncut episodes live on Patreon for our Patreon supporters.
Yep.
Including our previous episodes with Pace.
Yeah.
Yes.
This is what, my 4th time, I think? 4th, 5th?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah,
Right.
That's because Pace is special.
Well, I am
that's
special.
true. They are.
I'm going to start off by talking about Superman's in real life origin, because I think that's very important to this story, especially when we talk about the ways in which immigrants and children of immigrants can benefit or bring about things to their new homes, positive things to that. So Superman was created by Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster for the June 1938 Action Comics #1, the very first Action Comics. And it was an anthology comic, so like this large magazine of like 10 to 15 different stories, and Superman was just one of the stories in there, but he also made the cover as the most interesting story. And most of the comics at the time weren't really superhero comics because Superman was kind of the first one. So they were like about solving mysteries or kind of like some of the newspaper comics you might recognize and stuff like that. But he was created for this. He's widely considered to be the first superhero. This can be debated, of course, and what counts as a superhero and stuff. But he basically set the template of what makes someone a superhero ever since. So like Batman came out later that year. Wonder Woman first arrived in 1941. Marvel's first superheroes were Human Torch and the Submariner in 1939, and Captain America would appear in 41. So really, Superman just kind of started this explosion of these people with extraordinary abilities or powers who fight for justice and good in the world, that kind of thing. But Jerry and Joe were both Jewish, both children of Jewish immigrants to the United States. Well, actually, I think Jerry's family was an immigrant to Canada first, and then moved to the United States.
Still immigration.
Yep.
It counts when it's from Canada, despite the ways we've talked about culturally immigration and racism.
I suppose we could be talking about Ryan Reynolds today, but...
We could. Another superhero, Deadpool.
Which is going to be, but maybe is already out, our Patreon movie commentary for June. Deadpool 2.
Oh, hey. There you go.
Super queer.
So, if you think about 1939 and the climate, particularly for Jewish people in the West, in Europe and America, the fact that there was this kind of hero that was created as this champion in the very first issue of Action Comics, when Superman first makes his introduction, the text reads that Superman is the champion of the oppressed. And for Jerry and Joe to make this character as a champion for the oppressed, I think is very much a testament to the time and place that it was created of this rise in anti-Semitism. Particularly, we talk about in Europe, but also in the United States, this was happening too. The United States infamously refused immigrants from Europe trying to escape the Holocaust and stuff like that during this. So it's like the United States is complicit in this as much as we like to point the finger elsewhere.
Right.
And so, just very intentionally, Superman was created as this kind of hero who could fight back against all these forces of evil. And so that's one of the reasons I love him. But they both lived in Cleveland, Ohio, and that's where Superman originally was based in. So imagine all the Superman movies if they were set in Ohio, of all places. Sorry to dunk on Ohio, but you all know you did. But no, it was like... Right.
Yeah.
It was later retconned to Metropolis after a few issues, which is typically placed on the Delaware side of the Delaware River.
Aha.
And Gotham is on the New Jersey side of the Delaware River, so they're kind of twin cities in DC context.
Totally not New
So
York.
that's in real life. Yes.
Yeah. Right. Interesting. That's fascinating. I didn't know that about the places.
Yeah. And so sometimes Superman and Batman are intentional foils of each other, and that also goes to their cities too. Metropolis, this very bright city, and Gotham, this very crime-ridden dark city and stuff like that. Probably because Batman isn't actually good at his job, where Superman is, and is helpful.
Ooh! Pace throws the shade! All you Batman fans, let us know how you feel.
But I guess I could talk about Superman's fictional biography as well, which is like how he grew up and was raised and all that stuff in the comic book world. And I want to be very clear, especially for true blue comic book nerds and fans out there, that Superman's biography has shifted many times in the past almost 90 some years. So this is kind of the most current version of his biography, but it still kind of shares big broad brushstrokes with pretty much all the different iterations of Superman.
Yeah.
But anyway, he was born on this planet called Krypton to Kara and Jor-El, and it's a planet that orbits a red star.
Because space!
Yeah, space. Of course, Pace would have a superhero that has a lot to do with space. That's as their favorite superhero, of course. But the Kryptonians were a technologically advanced species, but their planet was destroyed, and Kara and Jor-El were trying to sound the alarm bells that their planet was facing a collapse and people were not listening to them. And as a kid, I used to think that was so far-stretched, like how would people ignore the fact that their planet is being destroyed? And just keep going about business as usual. But now as an adult, I kind of, my opinion on that, like, oh, that tracks.
Yeah.
Kind of sounds like us.
Yeah.
So Jor-El and Kara were trying to warn of this planetary cataclysm. And the cataclysm is different based on which version of the story is told. But some it's like the star explodes, some it's like this ecological damage or stuff like that. But anyway, when they found out that nobody was going to listen to them, they decided to build a spaceship in secret and launch their infant son, Kal-El, to the planet Earth to save him. They did not have the resources to build a larger spaceship, and they were trying to get people to do this, but nobody wanted to, so they had to kind of do it in secret and were only able to send their son and also his cousin, which is Supergirl, but that's a story for another day. So Kal-El's ship goes all the way from Krypton, wherever that is, to Earth and crash lands in this place called Smallville, Kansas, which I've been to Kansas, so I feel like Smallville could be an actual name for a place
right?
called Kansas.
Yeah. And I've watched Smallville.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
But his spaceship was discovered by these farmers, Martha and John Kent, and they were unable to have children and wanted children, so they used this as like kind of a sign from God, and so they adopted this son as their own, called him Clark, and basically tried to keep him secret because of him being from outer space. They're like, we don't trust that the government and people are going to treat this child the way he should be treated, so we're just going to pretend he's a human like us and was always ours and stuff like that.
Huh. I wonder what would have given them that idea.
Right. And it became pretty apparent early on in his childhood, though, that Clark was different than other kids.
He's not like other kids.
Yep, like his powers developed slowly over his childhood, but eventually he would have the power to fly, he would have super strength, invulnerability, rapid healing, laser vision. he can see in multiple spectrums of light, including X-rays, and he's essentially immortal. So that kind of started to become apparent as he was growing on, like when he would help his dad sow the fields with corn and could do it at rapid speed and do the entire fields in like 5 minutes. And his dad's like, that's not typical. So these kind of things. The S shield that he dons on the front of his costume is from his baby blanket, and that is a seal of the House of Krypton. It is not actually an S. Of course, this is all retconned. It was originally an S and stuff, but like in current continuity, it's not actually an S. I love that this plays into so much like real contemporary themes of like just assuming because it looks like an S in your language, it means it's an S. And it's like, no, this is a symbol, and it's actually supposed to be a snake. And the snake is a symbol in kryptonite culture that means hope. So his symbol is basically hope. And that's kind of what the current S means. And then, of course, he doesn't have a name, and it's Lois Lane who gives him the name Superman when she meets him after he saves her from falling out of a helicopter or plane, depending on the version of the story. And so she names him Superman because of the S, and that's how that name came about.
Nice.
But there's so much I want to talk about. I mean, he has 80, 90 years of history, so it's hard to try to like fit it down. But perhaps the most famous thing that I think is worth talking about, and it's also how I became a fan of Superman too, so that's why I think I want to throw it in here, is in the early 90s, there was the TV show Lois and Clark, The New Adventures of Superman, which I grew up on. Love that show. I also grew up on the Christopher Reeves movies. Those are important part of my Superman love. But there was that show Lois and Clark, and there were 4 comic books. This was like the golden age of Superman, friends. Like, let me tell you, to have 4 concurrently running monthly comic books on one character, even today, is unheard of. But that Superman had 4 titles that DC was running at the time. Now it's usually just 2. It's usually Action Comics and Superman. But back then there was Action Comics, Superman, The Adventures of Superman, and Man of Steel were the 4. And so they were kind of running this. They had the show Lois and Clark, New Adventures of Superman. And Lois and Clark in the comics were engaged and were going to get married. But the producers of the television show did not want Lois and Clark to get married in the comics before he got married in the TV show. So they asked the comics, can you delay their marriage for about a year? Because we want to give more time for that angst and romance and all that stuff in the TV show to kind of build that. So the comic book writers reluctantly agreed. I mean, they kind of had to. They were forced to. So they're like, now we have a year's worth of Superman stories that we need to come up with, and we don't know what to do. What are we going to do? Dan Jurgens, I think it was, who was one of the comic book writers, was like, well, why don't we just kill him? And so that's the...
What?
Literally from that what became the most popular and famous storyline of Superman comics. It's called The Death of Superman. It lasted for an entire year from the end of 1992 until the end of 1993. And it is the first major comic book character to die. And he would be resurrected, but like when he died, all 4 of the comics stopped publication and went on hiatus for 6 months, which was unheard of. To like stop the publications. They really wanted to drive it home that Superman died. And how he died was there was this new creature called Doomsday, and they battled it out and stuff. And Superman uses all of his energy to finally defeat Doomsday. And then he dies in Lois's arms. And it's just really like beautiful. Like, of all the Superman comics I could recommend, the Death of Superman arc is one of the best written and just so beautiful, even to this day. The artwork, everything.
Nice. Also, just real quick, we have an introduction to make.
Oh, yes.
Who has joined us, Kay?
Yes, Hobbs would like to say hello, and I guess he's a Superman fan too. Or at least he's a very enthusiastic himbo, which is close enough.
Yep, I love it.
I love it.
I love it. Yeah. So, Superman died, but the plan wasn't for him to stay dead because Superman. He can't kill off one of your main characters. So basically what the thing...
Especially not before the wedding.
Yeah.
No.
So basically what it was, they treated it as if...
He was dead for more than 3 days, right?
Yes. I mean, in the comic book world, he was dead for a year, which is like unheard of to have a major character dead for that long before he gets resurrected. But within the continuity of the comic books, he didn't actually die, like he just appeared dead, but he just ran out of juice.
So then he just had to charge in the sun.
Yeah, a year of recharging in a special solar suit before he was able to resurrect. But very intentionally a messianic story arc, which is interesting given Superman's Jewish origins as well. And but like that was 93. I was 7-ish, 8-ish when this was happening, right at that prime comic book age. So I just ate all of this up, and ever since then I've been a Superman fan.
Nice.
And then he finally marries Lois Lane in 1994. And then in the past about 10 years or so, they introduced a new person to the Superman family. Lois and Clark have a son. His name is John. Through comic book magic, he is now 17, even though he was only born in the last 10 years. And he is queer. So, and he also has the name Superman. So there are two Supermans right now. One of them is John Kent, and he is a queer Superman, and the other is Clark Kent, and he is a cis straight, as far as we know. I'm not fully convinced.
Sure.
/ I hope he's not fully straight because I want to be his boo. He's the Man of Steel, friends. Imagine what you could do with somebody called the Man of Steel.
If you're into that sort of thing. So can we take a moment to talk about Christopher Reeve?
Yes, please.
So I also watched the Christopher Reeve Superman movies, at least I think the first 3 of them, regularly when I was younger. And what I love about Christopher Reeve, if you look at the career section of his Wikipedia page, it talks a bit about what he was trying to do with the Superman character, and that he was trying to bring a certain amount of vulnerability and like emotional accessibility to Superman as a character, and that the idea that the original superhero had this more nurturing, gentle side is something that we don't really pay a lot of attention to these days. But as Christopher Reeve plays Superman, and as he plays Clark Kent, Superman in hiding, he is a character who has a gentler and more vulnerable side, and I think it's fascinating that the very first superhero ever who is a man also had that side to him.
Yeah. And there's so much I want to say about Superman, but exactly in line with that is this concept. Like Ben Monroe, who's a frequent guest on Horror Nerds at Church, he might rival my guest appearances on Nerds at Church for how many times he's been on Horror Nerds at Church. But he says that what to him in today's climate, in today's world, one of the most endearing things about Superman and what that can tell us about today is a man with godlike powers who chooses to be kind. And refuses to use those powers for his own personal gain, but only wants to do it for others. And how much that differs from our cultural understandings of power and how we use power and who has power. And that's also kind of a perfect foil for him is Lex Luthor, who's this cishet white boy who wants power and covets Superman's power and attempts to kill him. He's a billionaire. He's evil. He loves all the capitalism. He's kind of like Bruce Wayne, because Bruce Wayne's also a billionaire and evil, and he robs from his workers and beats them up at night as Batman. So like Lex Luthor is kind of like this Elon Musk or Jeffrey Bezos type of person. And there's this one story arc that eerily predicts Trump, where Lex Luthor actually becomes president. This is in the early 2000s, in part to try to pardon himself, but also to outlaw Superman and because Superman is, after all, an undocumented migrant.
Right.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
Yeah, but one of the things, too, that I love about Superman is he is one of the only superheroes that does not wear a mask. And the reason given in most of the comic continuities is because with the amount of power he has, to hide that face behind a mask would bring about fear of the people he's trying to help. But to have that vulnerability of saying, this is who I am, you get to see my full identity and know me as someone who's here to help, is why he refuses to wear a mask. And so the mask he wears, which is why me as an autistic person also really love Superman, is Clark Kent when he puts on the glasses and has to interact as other humans do.
And slouches.
But who he is through and through is Superman.
Yeah.
And slouchy, yes. That scene, go back to the first Superman movie, friends, with Christopher Reeves, and watch it. There's this scene that just shows Christopher Reeves' brilliant acting abilities when he is dressed as Clark Kent and he's debating whether or not he wants to tell Lois he's Superman. He takes off his glasses and suddenly stands up straight and he's Superman.
Yeah.
But then as soon as she comes back in, he slaps his back, puts his glasses on, and there's such a difference in the way that he carries himself as Superman from Clark Kent, and the way he masks himself as human in the character of Clark Kent to fit in.
So given that, if you could recommend one movie for people to watch to really get a sense of Superman, which one would it be? Would it be that one or a different one?
Yeah, so here's the problem is...
You can't pick just one.
Yeah, well, yes. So there's a lot of problems with this question. In fact, in part because DC doesn't know how to write for Superman anymore when it comes to movies. So, like, don't watch anything like Man of Steel, any of those, Dawn versus Batman versus Superman, Dawn of Justice. Like, that is not true to character of Superman. They try to make gritty, edgy Superman. That's not who Superman is.
Right.
That's who Batman is. And that's why it works for, like, the Batman Begins and all that stuff with Batman. But it doesn't work for Superman. So really, the first 4 Superman films with Christopher Reeve are really good. Still quality. They're a little problematic. They were made in the 70s and 80s. So, I mean, can't get away from that fully. But I think those are best. But a TV show, though, right now on Max, there's this TV show called My Pal Superman or something like that. Phenomenal. Definitely watch that. It's animated. And then also my personal favorite growing up, Lois and Clark, The New Adventures of Superman. You don't have to watch the whole thing, but just the pilot episode, which is an extra long episode, does a really good job of saying who Superman is and stuff like that. And you can watch that on Max as well.
Sure. Yeah.
In fact, I have so many Superman recommendations. I'm going to make a Superman syllabus for you all that hopefully Emily and Kay can put in the show notes, that will have links to comic book arcs, to books, to movies, to all that stuff that I recommend, because there's just so much good stuff out there.
Yep. We'll put that in the episode description for folks.
Yeah. And I've always thought, I'm sure that the original creators of Superman did this on purpose, but I love the fact that, Superman is one of the only superheroes where his super character is himself, and it's his day job that's his mask, that is the fake version, right, that he puts on.
Yeah.
And B, the fake mask that he puts on, that he chooses, is a journalist. And how unbelievably important is that, especially now?
Yeah, so the fact that Superman devotes his day life to seeking out truth, and his masked life as seeking out truth as a journalist, that can't be bought. Like, he and Lois Lane are like the dream team of journalists and the stuff, who like are doing all the journalist work that we celebrate, of trying to tear down people in power and all that stuff.
Yeah.
And so that's what he devotes his day job to, and then the rest of the time he's Superman and stuff. And that's another reason why a lot of people make fun of the fact that you just put glasses on and suddenly, and how can no one tell that Clark Kent's Superman because it's just glasses? Like, that's not much of a disguise. But like Earth 1, which is a comic book version of Superman, has this really awesome take on that, which is Superman doesn't wear a mask, so you don't assume he has a secret identity.
Yeah.
So just this journalist that looks very much like Superman isn't going to be Superman, because Superman is just this public person who doesn't need a secret identity.
Yeah.
And so that's how he can kind of get away with that too.
Yeah.
That's fascinating. Yeah, I really like that.
And besides, Clark is so unassuming and does not put himself forward and is so quiet. How could he possibly be Superman? Superman would have to be so much more forceful in his personality, right?
Right. This is what I find so weird about Western masculinities, is how many like people, bodybuilders and stuff, love Superman and all this stuff, when Superman himself is so anti-Western masculinity. He's like, Clark Kent is described as a mild-mannered reporter. He never talks over people. He always is like this bumbling fool kind of character and stuff like that. Lois Lane is the one who's the go-getter and the one who's asking the tough, hardball questions. And like Superman as Superman is devoting himself to kindness and to justice and to helping the oppressed. And it's such an opposite of these masculinities we assume with superheroes. And it really kind of upsets me that that's kind of this cultural understanding of who Superman is, when it's so unlike who his character is in the past 90 years of comics.
Yeah.
So does that mean Superman is the incarnation of do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly?
Yeah, I would totally say that, for sure.
Nice.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, in Action Comics #1, he's described as the champion of the oppressed. And then in the 1940s, during World War II and propaganda and stuff, they started saying he stands for truth, justice, and the American way, and especially when that turned to communism.
Yeah, that's the version that I heard.
But now they changed it. So now he's only truth and justice. That kind of went away in the 80s. But the American way, what's interesting to me is he's an immigrant. So we're saying that the American way is an immigrant who comes to a country to make the country better and work for justice and stuff like that. And that's what this America is.
And that's not even why he comes, right?
Yeah.
The American way is an immigrant who comes because his parents were desperate and tried to save his life.
Yeah.
And that is such a different framing of what it means to be an immigrant and what it means to be American. Yeah,
and
I love that.
There's so many themes I could bring up from this. Part of it is the fact that he has 4 parents, so he's adopted, and he still has relationship with his birth parent, like they're dead, obviously, the destruction of Krypton, but they sent like this kind of AI kind of thing in his ship that allows him to have conversations with them and stuff like that, as they would have been. And then he also very deeply loves John and Martha, who adopted him. And both of their values, both sets of the families instilled these values into him. And like, it always makes such a big deal of like, Superman is the person he is because of these values that his hardworking, down-to-earth, farming families instilled upon him, and that his scientist, brilliant birth mom and birth father also instilled in him, and working for justice and good, and what that means to always help someone in need. And so to that point, his creators were Jewish, so sometimes, depending on the continuity, sometimes Superman is also, Martha and John Kent are sometimes Jewish, sometimes they're Protestant Christian, depends on who's writing the comic. But I always like it when they write Superman as Jewish, because I think that's important and a way to honor the legacy of Jerry and Joe, who created him as well.
Yeah.
And he's also a vegetarian because he can see light in all spectrums, so he can see when the life force leaves a dying animal or dying person, and so that makes him want to be a vegetarian.
I love it. As a fellow vegetarian, yes, I'm here for this.
Yep. And modern stories really, like the comics of the past, especially since Trump has become president, have really, really picked up on Superman is an undocumented immigrant in this country.
Yeah.
And really have woven that into the story in ways that I think really are awesome and help kind of carry that point home. And just to be clear, I know this isn't the point of the thing, because we're talking about how immigrants have brought good to the places they live in, but immigrants should be allowed to exist without having to improve the places they're in.
Absolutely.
But also the reality is that many Black and brown people and marginalized folks do have to show excellence in order to be taken seriously. So it's kind of that both ends.
Yeah. And there's so much that goes to prevent and to work against them from doing good and improving and all of that stuff. And then when they do, there's so much that hides that and buries that so that it's not the front page of the news the way that every single bad thing ever is. And so, I think it's complicated, but it's also similar to the ways that we try to condense people into one single narrative. And that, like, we want them to be 100% good, 100% evil, nothing in between, all of that stuff. And the reality is people are more complicated than that. Also, the statistics are that crime rates and all of that stuff is actually lower among immigrant communities than it is among citizens of the country. So just saying, as a citizen who's been arrested.
I want to shout out two more things I think are important. It's one of the reasons I think Superman is such an enduring character, and why I love him so much is there have always, of course, it's comics. So, like, Superman has been dominated by cis white heterosexual male authors, sadly, as have all comics. But even so, there is still much more diversity in Superman's writing history than in many other comic books. So Louise Simonson was one of the big writers of Superman in the 80s and 90s. She wrote The Adventures of Superman, and she was one of the only women in comics at the time, especially writing for that big of a name of a character. Grant Morrison, I love every single Superman Grant Morrison story. Fantastic. All-Star Superman, highly recommend that one. That's perhaps Grant Morrison's most famous. Grant Morrison is non-binary and wrote for Superman a lot in the 90s and 2000s. Jeff Loeb and John Byrne are white guys, but they both get Superman in a way that many people don't. And then artist Jim Lee worked with Scott Snyder on this miniseries called Superman Unchained. Jim Lee is an Asian American artist and just brings such life and stuff to Superman. So I think that's a lot of what makes Superman so unique, is the diversity of his writing staff have really helped hone in on some of that.
Yeah.
And then I just want to shout out that as somebody who struggles with depression and I've had suicidal ideation in the past, there's these two scenes from two different versions of Superman comics. A Superman helping somebody who is planning to jump off a building to take their own life, because it's Metropolis, lots of high buildings. And the first is from Superman Grounded, and basically Superman meets this person who wants to jump off the building, and he has this conversation with the person, and the person says that they don't want Superman to save them and stuff like that. So Superman promises that he won't, but he will stay there with them as long as it takes. And so there's like this scene in this comic art can do this so beautifully of like the sun setting, then it becoming night, and then early morning, and Superman is still just there, being present with this person until that person is ready, and just like being a support for the person without telling what to do and stuff like that. So I just love that.
You put that in the episode planning document, and I felt the power of that as I was like reading it. And one of the things I love is when they do ask Superman for something, to do something, it's because they have this giant spotlight trained on them, which is so problematic. And they're like, can you get them to shut that off? And Superman just like laser beams the cord so that they can't even like turn it back on again at all. And it's just like, because sometimes you need the space to actually just be and think and process more slowly without all of the extra stimulation and external pressure and all of that stuff. And so I think of Superman in that sense kind of as like an umbrella or like a bubble around the person, right? Holding that space with them so that they have the time that they need. Yeah.
And there's another one from All-Star Superman, which is kind of similar, but Superman just shows up behind somebody and just embraces that person as they're thinking about ending their life and says, you're much stronger than you think you are, trust me. And that coming from Superman, who's the strongest man alive, and I say in air quotes, to be able to kind of say that and be vulnerable with somebody. So those, and that's from All-Star Superman. So both of those have really just beautiful scenes that have impacted my own life and suicidal ideation and depression journey. So I want to share that with all of y'all.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So we've talked about kind of the main connection, right? The ways that immigrants and their families impact the communities that they're in, and like that sort of heroism of, as God says in Jeremiah, plant and grow and prosper in the place that you find yourself. And so I'm curious what other connections that all of us notice between our heroes for today, in addition to that kind of one main theme.
I can start off and just say identity seems to be a reoccurring theme from all of them. Ruth's identity as a Moabite, and then the famous wedding vow verse, which is the really wedding vows that she has with Naomi, your people will be my people, and just how similar that is to Superman adopting humankind as his people, since his people are no more, he's the last Kryptonian, and how that ties into Cesar Chavez and his story, and coming together at these identity as laborers and farmers, and how can we come together to make something larger than ourselves.
Yeah. And I think especially Delores Huerta, where it was how her mom treated farm workers and cared for farm workers that inspired it. It was not necessarily her particular community. She wasn't a farm worker. And so what does that, like that space where you recognize the group outside of yourself, and that kind of identity and belonging is really cool. I forgot about Naomi and her name change, and so then when we were doing, I was like, in that realm of identity, right, there's a lot of name changing and claiming of identity and growth and transformation, where Delores Huerta and Cesar Chavez are not trans, but Delores Huerta talks about being a born-again feminist and what that looks like, to have this renewal and transformation of identity, and then also like to have Clark Kent have multiple names that he goes by that are simultaneously like him and not. And then to have Naomi have changed her name to Mara Bitter Tears. That's a really cool connection piece that I hadn't thought of before we recorded. Yeah.
I would also say, as someone who lives and works in a rural community, there's a certain respect for the place of agriculture in all of these stories as well. Because, I don't know how to put this, I went to a school that churns out rural pastors on a regular basis, and yet while I was there, I did not really observe a lot of respect for people who do agriculture work. There was a certain assumption of a lack of intellectual ability of those who do agriculture work that I experienced while I was there. And I have worked with a lot of people in rural settings, and no one person, no matter how strange they are to you, actually is a stereotype. Like, people have different aspects of themselves and are fully rounded human beings. And so in Ruth, in the United Farm Workers, and in Ma and Pa Kent, you find people who do agriculture work who are all fully rounded human beings and deserve a basic amount of human respect for that, because it's hard and difficult work and is also literally vital to the continued survival of humanity.
One of the many things I love about the seminary I went to, Gettysburg Lutheran Seminary, now United, is that they actually had a program for rural ministry. I'm trying to remember what it was called, but they still have it. And I think that is where so many churches are, that I'm happy that there is a place that does intentional training for rural settings and honoring that. I wish that was more of a thing in the church than it is, and not just a one seminary program, but all the seminaries.
Yeah, I had multiple professors tell me that I was too smart to be a rural pastor, and that is absolutely insulting. And also absolutely not true, because my brain is challenged every single day in this job. So
And part of why this is so problematic is, a lot of seminary professors also used to be pastors in those congregations, right? But also part of the problem is that pastors stopped doing the work that was necessary. They stopped talking about the real injustices that are in the world. They stopped making those connections for folks. And because of the dynamics of rural congregations being smaller and it being harder to, afford full pastoral support and that sort of a thing, the more urban congregations or suburban congregations have been able to recover some from that in a way that is harder for rural congregations because they can't always afford a full-time pastor, and
not to mention curriculums.
The options are limited. So the options are more limited, and nobody has been doing that work to help them continue to grow. People have decided that they are this way and have decided to just let people be stagnant, which is just, it's mind-blowing for me, right? Like, why we wouldn't want to continue to grow and question and learn. And when I was in rural ministry, we did lots of that. We had lots of conversations, and people loved when, LSS of Minnesota did a whole curriculum, a whole series on getting to know Islam while also getting to know Christianity together. And so it was billed as a study on Islam. And we did that, and they loved it. And then we got to go visit a community that had an open house day and stuff, and it was fantastic.
Yeah, I did that too.
But you have to trust that people actually want to learn and want to know things. Yeah.
And I hate, because we're recording this in Pride Month, yay gay. I want to say, the amount of times I've heard so many pastors say, I would love to have a welcoming and inclusive church, but my church is a rural congregation. And it's like us queers live in the rural areas too, y'all. We
Mhm.
don't just live in cities. Like,
Yeah.
we exist. So honor your people and honor the queer people among you, but also honor your rural people enough to like have the conversations, because they can be a
Mhm.
lot more welcoming and affirming than your prejudice is letting you think they are.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And also, those are the conversations that need to happen.
Yeah.
Yeah. There are a lot of trends and tropes in rural congregations that can help you do that, because rural people are not known for wanting to follow the masses. Rural people are not known for wanting to follow the trends. They like the image of themselves as independent mavericks, and you can use that to lead them toward being open and affirming. You can acknowledge the fact that they don't really like being told what to do, or, you know, being told how they should look. There was a hilarious joke going around Blue Sky a couple of months ago about someone was trying to type gender neutral, and there was a typo, and the computer autocorrected to gender rural. And so many people said, yes, I have found my gender. My gender is rural. And
Oh
like,
my gosh.
I am a cis woman, but I have to
Yeah.
say, in terms of presentation, yeah, I present gender rural, folks. I do not wear makeup.
I love
brush my
that.
hair and don't do much else. I wear a lot of jeans. You know, like, gender rural is my home. And part of the reason why I like rural congregations is that they don't tell me how I should dress.
Yeah, I really like that too. Yeah.
But this anti-capitalist kind of theme of all the superheroes we're talking about today,
Yeah.
of especially the labor movement work of Delores, Huerta, and Cesar Chavez.
I mean, like, people accused him of being communist, and
Yeah.
the government started following him and
Yeah,
and
yeah.
investigating him. Yeah, and the whole United
And
Farmers.
it's intentional that Superman's primary villain is this rich billionaire, and Superman is this journalist during the day trying to take down and not be bought, but trying to take down these corporate corruptions and stuff like that.
And Ruth sees the local rich guy and decides to claim him for her own. Which is, you know, please don't
Yeah.
do it the way she did, folks. That's not a good idea. But
Yeah, that's not
Yeah.
right, but yeah. Yeah, I think that's a really good one.
And like, Superman doesn't collect money for being a superhero either. He just
Right.
does it for free, which is also
Yeah.
very anti-capitalist. He's not trying to monetize saving people or rescuing people. He's not checking whether someone is an undocumented migrant before he helps them, or if they have health insurance before he takes them to a hospital. He just helps.
Yeah.
Yeah. Is there anything else about Superman that you really wanted to say that you haven't gotten to yet, Pace?
Oh my gosh, so much, but I'll try to be real quick. So Superman has a family of other superheroes, like Batman has a family of not like, more like chosen family, like super
Sure.
heroes that kind of fit under the same moniker, kind of like how Captain America has Falcon and the Winter Soldier guy and stuff, like basically kind of groups of superheroes. Superman's family of heroes includes his cousin Kara Zor-El, who was also sent to Earth by her family. But it includes Steel, who is this black man, kind of had these stereotypical black superhero origins, but has since become this really cool superhero in and of himself. And he wears the Superman moniker, and his niece, I want to say, Natasha Irons, is also now a superhero. Superman's son, John Kent. Then there's also Connor Kent, who's Superboy, and Crypto, Superdog, and stuff. So I just love the entire cast as Superman. Extended family of heroes.
Yeah.
Superman also turned blue for a weird minute in the 90s, which I feel like I just need to mention for that weird minute of the electric blue Superman that lasted for a few years after he died and came back. And he had electric blue powers. It was like the most 90s story arc ever.
Yeah.
It's not well remembered, but I just love to shout it out because it's
Did they
weird.
play the song? I'm blue, da ba dee da.
No, I think the song came after that. Because that's like a late 90s song. This was like 1995. when this happened.
Okay, bummer.
And the last thing I'll say is, I have a Superman tattoo, and it is based off of Superman's appearance in the Fleischer Studios animated series from the 1940s. And one of the reasons that I have that tattoo is because Superman could fly for the first time in that series, because before then he could just leap over really tall buildings and stuff like that, and that was one of his superpowers. But when they're trying to animate Superman and bring him into visual medium beyond just comic books and radio plays, they're like, just having him jump really high isn't that much of a power. So that's when they gave him the power to fly. It came back into the comics. And so I love that kind of exchange and Superman being able to fly and stuff.
Did that happen because there was like a special solar flare?
No.
Like a little
That was,
whoosh.
but the newer versions of Superman does have a power called solar flare, which is where he expends all of his solar energy at once from his cells, and it leaves him powerless for 24 hours, but it creates this giant, like, cool comic-y thing that takes out any villains and stuff. And then the last thing that I would be remiss to not shout out is in the 1940s, there was a radio version of Superman's adventures, because radio was really big then.
Sure.
I think it's just called The Adventures of Superman. But one of the arcs of that is Superman fighting against this fictionalized version of the Ku Klux Klan, and Superman actively fighting against them. And what happened, this is like such a cool story. So one of the writers for the radio show actually would go undercover to Klan meetings and would learn the secrets, and then would talk about the secrets of the Klan meetings on air as Superman, like fighting against these people as a way to discredit the Ku Klux Klan. And this arc in Superman's story actually helped make membership of the Ku Klux Klan reach the lowest point it had in decades because of Superman fighting against the Ku Klux Klan and openly standing up against them.
Awesome.
Yeah, and so there's this recent graphic novel that took the radio version and kind of modernized it, and it's called Superman Clashes the Klan, or something like that. It'll be on the list I send, but it's told by a Black author and stuff, and repurposes that radio story into a comic book story, and just does a really good job of that. So I love that Superman works for real world justice too, not just fictional justice.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And it sounds like
that's
there
awesome.
was journalism involved in that.
Yep, very much so.
Indeed.
Okay, so now it's time for our Muppets moment, and our question for this and our following episodes is, which Muppet would you cast for which hero? Pace, as our guest, would you like to go first?
Sure. So I guess I'll go in backwards order. So Superman, I feel like by necessity, I just would love this Muppets movie where Superman is the one human character surrounded by Muppets. I think that would show his down-to-earthness and kindness, and he can be a really good straight man to the wild antics of others, and especially like in comics, but he's usually the straight man to Batman's edgelord antics. So
Who would you have be the token human then?
What actor would play?
Like, are we traveling back in time to Christopher Reeve? Are we getting somebody new? Who would play that straight man?
yes, I've always though had in mind of who would be the perfect Superman would be Idris Elba. I want Idris Elba to play Superman so bad, and I think this would be perfect for that. And there is a black Superman too in the comic too, and Calvin Kent in a different universe. But anyway,
I like
and
it.
he would
I
have
like
so
it.
much fun with the Muppets. You can just tell. Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Also, I think the Muppets are biased toward working with British actors anyway. They seem to enjoy it. But
Yeah.
Yeah.
I am less interested in casting Superman, honestly, than I am in casting Lois Lane, because Lois Lane, with her constant enthusiasm and go-gettingness, feels very Muppety to me, and so obviously Miss Piggy is the perfect Lois Lane. I'm just saying.
I think so
And
too.
who wouldn't fall in love with her? Absolutely.
Right, agreed. And Clark Kent is very much a Kermit-y kind of character. Superman isn't, but Clark Kent in that part. So
Yeah, that's true.
totally on board. What about you, Emily? Have anyone for Soups?
Or would you like to cast Lex Luthor?
Yeah. Ooh, who's the most evil Muppet?
I mean, I always cast Sam Eagle in that category, but it's also
That
tricky.
tracks.
We talked about this in our introductory episode, that we have an overarching Bible passage as a theme for this season. But I think also if we were to cast a Muppet for this whole season, like, the Muppet for the season is, of course, Gonzo the Great, because actual superhero, right? Like,
Yeah.
Sure.
but yeah, I don't know about Superman. That was the one that I struggled the most with.
Oh, you know who could play Clark Kent, too, in addition to Kermit? Doesn't Kermit's nephew, Robin, doesn't he have, like, a side job as a student journalist in some of the Muppet shows? Like, I remember
I
him
think
running
he-
around
yeah.
with a pencil and a notepad a lot. And so he would,
That sounds
make
right.
a good casting for Clark Kent, too.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good one.
For Ruth, I struggle with all of these, but for Ruth, the person I landed on is Red Fraggle from Fraggle Rock, one of the main characters of that, but just so much energy. Mostly I did it because of the alliteration of Ruth and Red Fraggle, but also just because I think Red Fraggle is really cool and has a lot of enthusiasm and stuff. And
Yeah. I was thinking about that, and I was thinking about Noor, and Noor and Aziz are Muppets from kind of the Sesame Street realm, but they are specifically refugees that were created for a particular show for refugees in refugee camps. And I was thinking about that as Noor knows so deeply and so well the moving to save a life, moving with family, moving because there is nothing left in a place for them. And so I think she would just be a fantastic cast for Ruth.
Yeah. And now that you brought up Sesame Street, I finally figured out who I wanted to cast. I was thinking to myself, who would I cast as Boaz in the story of Ruth? Because Boaz is such a rule follower character. Like, he characterizes his caring for Ruth and her mother-in-law so thoroughly as being part of his faith and following the rules of his society and so forth. And who do we know who follows rules and who also cares about people but really focuses on the rules? That would be Bert. I think Bert would make a really interesting Boaz. Because the thing is that while we give Bert a lot of crap for following the rules and wanting to be kind of a square guy, he does actually care about people. He does actually love people. And I think he would be an interesting cast for Boaz.
would that make Ruth be Ernie then?
I don't know if Ernie is Ruth, but I think Ernie would be kind of like the practice round for Ruth. Like,
Okay.
Ernie is what taught Bert how to be Boaz for Ruth. Ernie is maybe the little brother Boaz had
like it.
growing up that he had to look after. And, yeah.
Yeah. What about Delores Huerta, Cesar Chavez?
So for me, I struggle with casting Muppets as real life people. So my compromise I had was one of two things. First, speaking of Sesame Street, would be to see Delores Huerta and Cesar Chavez as celebrity cameos on Sesame Street, like in an alternate world where they just came and talked about workers' rights and farmers' rights and stuff like that on a Sesame Street episode and interact with all.
Yeah.
And then, alternatively, if we got custom Muppets to represent them, like in the Muppet movie, Am I a Man or a Muppet Song, I would love that too.
Yes.
Yeah.
I also think that we totally need a musical story of their lives with the musical stylings of the Electric Mayhem Band.
Yes.
Like, that is
Always.
the perfect band to be in the background of their bio stories. Yeah.
Yeah. I was thinking of them, and Sam Eagle came to mind for Cesar Chavez, that there's this, like, very fierce push and call to doing what is right, and a very clear mission and identity, and also a little, like, controversial, not without faults, shall we say, and not without some harmful ideas of what it means to be American. I was thinking about Sam Eagle as Cesar Chavez, but then, Ruth, when you were talking about Bert as Boaz, Ernie came to mind for Delores Huerta, because he is so full of love and care, and goes different places and does different things. And Delores Huerta, for as much as she is known for the United Farm Workers, has done so much and still does so much to improve the lives, to work for justice. And so I was like, that feels like an Ernie kind of thing to do to me. Wonderful. Well, Pace, any other thoughts on life, the universe, and everything?
If you also have the moniker Man of Steel, call me.
Fantastic.
And do you have any new and exciting things coming out soon, Pace, that you would like to tell our listeners about?
By the time this comes out, Horror Nerds at Church will be probably on hiatus between seasons or wrapping up. But if you haven't listened to our Star Wars and Alien season, definitely go back and check it out.
It's fantastic.
Yeah, our next season is going to be on witches, and we don't know quite what movies that will be and quite when it will start, but probably in the fall to tie in with spooky season. That's all happening.
Fabulous.
Yeah, I have a million side hustles always happening and publications and stuff happening. So check out my Facebook page, which will be linked in the show notes. But Pace Warfield, I try to put my stuff there.
Yeah. And speaking of which, our seasonal artwork for this season, our new seasonal artwork is by Pace Warfield. And
yay, that's me.
And fabulous.
Yeah, you always do a great job. And this is like such a delightful and fun, like, superhero design. And yeah, Kay and I are thrilled with that. Yeah, so thank you for joining us, Pace. And
absolutely,
thank you for joining us, dear nerdlings. I still haven't gotten feedback on if anybody likes or dislikes that. Mostly because our listeners are more of the silent appreciator types.
Lurkers are cool too.
Yeah. Our theme music was by Rachel Meyer-Laughlin. Our Muppets music was by Brenda Boss. And as mentioned, our seasonal artwork was by the one and only Pace Warfield. Catch us next time when we'll dive into the Daughters of Zelophehad and more. This podcast has been produced by us, Emily Ewing and Kay Rohloff. For more fun, check us out on Twitter, Facebook, and Blue Sky at Nerds at Church, or contact us at nerdsatchurch@gmail.com.
Also, if you like what you've heard, rate us or leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Facebook, or wherever you catch your podcasts. If you want to access our uncut episodes, merch discounts, movie commentaries, and more, support us on Patreon at patreon.com/nerdsatchurch. Starting at just $5 per month, it's much cheaper than building a tiny little spaceship to send your infant child to another planet so that they can survive the destruction of yours.
Yep.
Indeed. Also, let us know on Blue Sky, Facebook, or Twitter who you would cast for any of our heroes for today.
As the ancient Christians said,
Pax Vobiscum.